God's many-coloured works of art. No, this isn't about Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, made famous by the musical. It is about God's creativity and what we can learn about it from things that Paul says in his letter to his friends in Ephesus. My thinking about this was triggered by a Facebook post by Claudia Beavers-Lewis of Calvin University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And this took me, with the help of Charles Stromer, to one of his Waging Wisdom blogs, one that he posted about 5 years ago. And then, suddenly, out of the blue, another good friend of mine, an Irish friend named Matt Tuttleby, posted a video on Facebook. And all through this time, I was also in touch with another friend, Alexandra Kingswell, about her artistic work. And what I was learning from these four people came together in what feels like a four-part harmony, which I hope you will find helpful. I don't know which of these four will be singing soprano and which alto, or which tenor and which bass, but for me, it all feels like it fits together. God's many-coloured wisdom, God's many-textured wisdom. Ephesians 3 and verse 10. The story begins back on the 7th of June, when a friend of mine, Tom Hoeksema, shared a post by one of his Calvin colleagues. Tom was the head of the education department at Calvin College, now Calvin University, when I was a visiting teacher there on several occasions back in the noughties. And Tom shared this post by Claudia Beavers-Lewis. And it was about the meaning of a Greek word that Paul uses in Ephesians 3 verse 10, the Greek word that he uses for manifold. Claudia says that she loves markets because they are usually places filled with colour, texture, smell, sound, chaos, and beauty. And so she points out, with a significance for the current debate about racism, she points out that when Paul uses the word polypoikilos for manifold in 3:10, that word is not an academic word. It's a word from the marketplace, a word of the street, a word for colours and textures and fabrics and art. It means many-coloured or many-textured. And Claudia goes on to say that Paul's wonder, surprise, and delight can be heard in this passage in Ephesians. And she imagines him exclaiming, "What we thought was in monochrome, look, it's in purple and green and red and blue. This God has a different story than the one we thought was happening. And I, Paul, am alive to tell it." And the wonder for Paul was the coming together in one people of God of Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. Ephesians 2 talks about the dividing wall of hostility being destroyed. And the wonder for us in our day and age is surely the coming together of people from innumerable different cultures into the one people of God. in this many-colored, many-textured people of God, Ephesians 2:22 says, we are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives. God's handiwork, God's poem, God's masterpiece, Ephesians 2 and verse 10. And the story continues. I was musing about what Claudia had written, and it triggered a memory for me, a recollection that at some time in the past I'd heard or read that the word translated handiwork could be translated work of art. And I mentioned this in a message to my friend Charles Stromer, and he immediately replied with a link to a 5-year-old blog by him in his Waging Wisdom series. And it was a blog that was entitled Christ the Editor. And I immediately realized that this was almost certainly the source for which my aged memory was casting around. Charles's blog, Christ the Editor, and he points out that the word that's translated handiwork in Greek is poema. And he says that this word was derived from a word for all kinds of craftsmanship. Back in Homer's time, it was used for pieces crafted from metal. And he says it developed into a word that often denoted what we today would call artistic work, including the work of somebody who wrote a book or a play. And by Plato's time, he and others after him also used poema, especially of poetic works. And Charles goes on in his blog to reflect on how great poems get written. And he says, just as every note in a musical score is significant, every word in a poem tells, and tells significantly. And it does not line up that way by chance or sloth. Poetry, with its compact, exact language and precise punctuation, may be the most carefully crafted and painstakingly written and edited form of communication. Poets will fight tooth and nail with a publisher over the placement of a comma. And he goes on to picture Christ as the editor working with us on the stories of our lives and replying to us after we've submitted the latest draft to him. And Charles says, patience, Christ the editor responds to our submission. You're making good progress, but we've still got a few wrinkles to iron out. You have a tendency to get ahead of yourself, or fall behind, or forget about a change that's been made already. And you are still inclined to insist on keeping material from the old story. I know it's slow and painful at times, I get that. But keep in mind that I've already been sending parts of your story around for reviews. And as you know, they're being well received. So hang in there. You want that masterpiece I promised, don't you? So, Christ the editor asks, when will you have that next draft ready for me? And the story continues. God, the restorer, God, the master craftsman. It continues with me now musing on what Claudia and Charles had written about these passages in Ephesians. And that sent me to the book of Acts to find out more about Paul's 2-year stay in Ephesus, a 2-year stay that ended with a riot. It all started, according to Acts 19, by a silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines of Artemis. Artemis, or Diana, as she was also known, was worshipped in Ephesus. And the silversmith called together the craftsmen for whom the worship of Artemis brought in a lot of business. And he also called together the workers in related trades. That's in Acts 19, 24 and 25. And soon they had the whole city in uproar, which led to Paul having to leave. So, from this, we observe that Ephesus was the home of skilled craftsmen. And Acts 19 says their trade had a good name, 19 verse 27. And of course, Paul himself was a craftsperson. He was a tent maker. And it seems that he worked at tent making through the 2 years that he spent in Ephesus. Because if we turn to the next chapter, to his farewell message to his friends in Ephesus, he says this: "You yourselves know that these hands of mine have supplied my own needs and the needs of my companions." Acts 20, verse 34. And it was in the midst of these thoughts about the passages in Ephesians and the kind of city that Ephesus was, suddenly out of the blue, a video was posted on Facebook on June the 14th. And I found myself watching and listening to this 8-minute video. It had been uploaded that morning by an Irish friend of mine, Matt Tuttleby, and this was the latest in his series of Bundoran Bible reflections. And this particular one was entitled "A Longing for Restoration." And Matt says he loves a good restoration project. And he talked about how he restored some garden furniture for a friend of his who had brought him a table, a bench, and 2 chairs. And he says they looked tired and sad, rickety and brittle, and they were ravaged by woodworm and water damage. And Matt refers to that verse, Ephesians 2, verse 10, about our being God's handiwork. And he says, God's work in our lives can be painful at times because it will expose faults of which we were not aware or didn't want to face. And restoring the table and the chairs involved abrasive processes, the process of planing the wood and sanding it to make it smooth. And Matt says God, who is the master craftsman, is also patient and gentle with us, like the furniture restorer who's applying wood stain to the wood and waiting for the paint to dry. God, the fabric designer. We come now to the 4th person in our quartet. And through the days of this developing story, I was also in touch with another old friend, Alexandra Kingswell. Alex, I first got to know back in the 90s when I was working on a curriculum project at the Stapleford Centre near Nottingham. And Alex was the designer for the classroom materials that teams of teachers were producing, classroom materials that we published as the Caris Project. But since that time, Alex had become a designer of beautiful one-off textile artwork in which she says on her website, she explores the creative potential of number, proportion, sequence, and color. And a number of her works make use of the Fibonacci sequence. And as it happened, at that time, I was working on two blogs, one on the Fibonacci sequence and one on the golden ratio. And that was why we were corresponding together. And in one of her emails, Alex says that she loves those Old Testament passages that talk of God designing the fabrics in the temple and his equipping of artisans with skill to do the work. And this took me to some Old Testament passages. I went to Exodus 28, which tells of skilled workers to whom God had given wisdom to make priestly garments for Aaron using gold and blue, purple and scarlet yarn and fine linen. That's Exodus 28 and verse 5. And I went also to 2 Chronicles chapter 2, which tells of preparations for building the temple. And it mentions a remarkable person, a very gifted man. His name was Huram-Abi. And it says, he was a man of great skill, trained to work in gold and silver, bronze and iron, stone and wood, and with purple and blue and crimson yarn and fine linen. He is experienced in all kinds of engraving and can execute any design given to him. He will work with your skilled workers. That's 2 Chronicles 2, verses 13 and 14. And looking at Alex's work, I believe it is the work of a skilled artist. And it displays that many-colored, many-textured wisdom that Claudia spoke about in her Facebook post. So there we have our 4-part harmony. Of course, all of this applies at the level of the individual who trusts Christ. God is at work in each of us to transform us into the image of Christ. But we surely can't stop with just that individualistic account. Ephesians is about the whole people of God. The whole people of God from innumerable cultures, all brought together in one many-colored, many-textured work of art. In a recent talk entitled Undermining Racism, Tom Wright talks about this as being polychrome unity. All the colours have their place, just as all the notes have their place in a piece of music, and all the words and indeed the punctuation marks in a poem, and all the components of Matt's beautiful upcycled garden furniture, and all the many-coloured pieces that Alex has put together in her creations. Let us pray. Lord, you came as a man and worked for many years in the skilled craft of carpentry in Nazareth. In you, all things hold together. Help us to use the creative gifts that you have given us in a way that attracts people to you and brings you honor and praise. Amen. Thank you.